For nearly 200 years, the case of Kaspar Hauser was considered unsolvable, a historical enigma suspended between rumor, political calculation, and contradictory testimony. Yet in 2024, something occurred that fundamentally altered this narrative. Science raised its voice, and it did so not with conjecture, but with DNA. For the first time, the biological traces attributed to Kaspar Hauser were compared with the genetic lineage of the House of Baden. For the first time, the question was no longer whether one wished to believe him, but whether one could afford to ignore the findings. The notion that a man might have been dismissed for generations as an impostor, while his origins lay hidden within the archives of European monarchy, suddenly acquired an unsettling weight. But what does scientific proof mean when it arrives too late to save a life? Kaspar Hauser was a young man without documented ancestry, without family, without a secure place in the world. And yet much suggests that he embodied precisely what could threaten a dynasty: legitimacy, blood, claim. If a child is separated at birth not only from his mother, but from his identity, if power determines who may inherit and who must disappear, then this is not merely a personal tragedy. It becomes a question of historical responsibility. This story does not begin in the darkness of confinement, nor in a marketplace in Nuremberg. It begins with a discovery that waited almost 2 centuries to be heard, and it compels us to ask whether history is ever truly past, or whether it merely waits for science to catch up with it. Kaspar Hauser is no longer only a mystery of the 19th century. He has become a measure of how we confront truth when it emerges late, but undeniable. If science in 2024 forces us to reconsider the past, it does so because there was a moment when everything began. A moment when a young man stepped out of obscurity and, without intending to, set in motion a question that would echo for nearly 2 centuries. That moment occurred in the spring of 1828. On the evening of the 26th of May, 1828, a young man appeared in the city of Nuremberg. He stood in the Unschlittplatz, uncertain on his feet, holding 2 letters in his hands. He seemed as though he had emerged without history. No companions, no visible origins, no narrative to explain his presence. When questioned, he spoke haltingly. His language was rudimentary, mechanical, almost rehearsed. Again and again, he repeated the same sentence. He wished to be a writer, as his father was. Who this father might be, he could not say. Where he had come from, he did not know. The name he laboriously wrote down appeared memorized rather than lived: Kaspar Hauser. In a society where lineage defined identity, this young man was a rupture in the order of things. No regional dialect betrayed his upbringing. No knowledge anchored him in any recognizable social structure. Officials, physicians, and citizens alike responded with a mixture of curiosity and unease. It quickly became evident that this was no ordinary foundling. Caspar did not understand money. Loud noises startled him profoundly. Bright light caused visible distress. Physical contact unsettled him. His movements were awkward, almost childlike. And yet he possessed the basic ability to read and write, though he seemed not to grasp the deeper meaning of words within a social context. It was a contradiction that invited suspicion, but yielded no clear explanation. Gradually, he began to recount fragments of his past. A dark room, years of isolation, a man who brought him food but never spoke, a childhood without faces, without voices, without the world as others know it. To some, this account sounded implausible. To others, it explained precisely what stood before them. At this stage, few suspected that the fate of this young man might one day be connected to the inner succession struggles of a German ruling house. He was regarded as a curiosity, a pedagogical anomaly, perhaps even a medical case. Yet beneath the surface, a more unsettling question had already begun to form. How could a human being have been so completely erased from history? The genetic findings of 2024 compel us to redirect our gaze, not to Nuremberg, but to Karlsruhe. Not to the young man who appeared in 1828, but to an event that took place 16 years earlier, at the very heart of the Baden Dynasty. If modern science now suggests a biological connection, Then the decisive trace leads back to the year 1812, to a birth officially followed by death, and to a moment when the balance of power within a ruling house quietly shifted. In the Grand Duchy of Baden, uncertainty prevailed. Grand Duke Karl was in fragile health, and his marriage to Stephanie de Beauharnais, Napoleon's adopted daughter, carried immense political significance. The future of the dynasty rested upon a single hope: the birth of a legitimate male heir. On the 29th of September, 1812, Stephanie gave birth to a son. According to official records, the child died only days later. The announcement was swift, remarkably swift. The court accepted the news with restrained formality. A burial was reported, yet few claimed to have seen the infant's body. Documentation was sparse. Testimonies would later prove inconsistent. What remained was a vacuum. With the declared death of the heir, another branch of the family moved closer to power. The descendants of the Countess of Hochberg, once a morganatic connection to the ruling house, suddenly assumed new political relevance. A line previously regarded as secondary was now positioned to inherit the future of Baden. Rumors surfaced almost immediately. Had the child truly died, or had he been removed quietly, deliberately? Was his disappearance a tragic coincidence, or a calculated act of dynastic preservation? In the decades that followed, irregularities persisted. Sealed documents, midwives who remained silent, physicians who later revised their statements, a court that deflected questions rather than addressed them, and a Grand Duchess who, until her death, is said to have believed that her son had survived. Stephanie de Beauharnais never publicly accused anyone of wrongdoing. She issued no formal protest. Instead, she withdrew. Observers described a woman marked by reserve and a profound inner distance. It was as though silence had become her only remaining form of dignity. Into this fragile historical structure, years later, stepped Kaspar Hauser, a young man without origins, without a family, without a past. Yet his age aligned uncannily with that of the child declared dead in 1812. Was this coincidence, or the first visible fracture in a carefully constructed narrative? With the tragedy of 1812, the case of Kaspar Hauser acquires an entirely new dimension. It ceases to be merely a psychological puzzle. It becomes political, a question of legitimacy, of succession, and of the price dynasties may be willing to pay to secure their continuity. If Kaspar Hauser's own account is to be taken seriously, then his true life did not begin with birth, but with the opening of a door. What preceded that moment can scarcely be described as childhood. He spoke of a small, windowless room, of a straw bed, of bread and water, of a wooden toy horse as his only companion. The man who brought him food never engaged him in conversation. There were no lessons, no affection, no visible hostility. Only function, only maintenance. From the perspective of modern psychology, such conditions would have devastating consequences. Human development is not merely biological. Language, self-awareness, moral understanding, and emotional regulation arise through interaction. Deprived of sustained human contact, a child does not simply grow more slowly, he grows differently. Observers in 1828 were struck by Kaspar's peculiar sensitivities. He reacted intensely to light. Sudden sounds overwhelmed him. His gait was unstable, as though he had not fully learned to inhabit his own body. At times, he appeared almost painfully innocent. At others, disoriented, as though reality itself were a fragile surface beneath his feet. Contemporary physicians struggled to interpret what they saw. Some suspected deception. Others spoke cautiously of deprivation. Today, the concept of sensory isolation provides a more coherent framework. Prolonged confinement in a stimulus-poor environment can impair cognitive development, distort perception, and fragment memory. Particularly striking was Kaspar's relationship to narrative truth. His recollections did not unfold in linear chronology. They emerged as images, isolated impressions, unanchored to a wider context. To critics, this inconsistency appeared suspicious, yet it may equally reflect the inner architecture of a life shaped by isolation rather than dialogue. The essential question is therefore not whether Kaspar Hauser was credible in every detail. It is what had been taken from him long before he ever spoke. 12 years in darkness do not merely conceal a child. They alter him. They render him vulnerable intellectually, emotionally, socially, and such vulnerability, in a world governed by power and reputation, can become perilous. For as Caspar gradually learned to articulate fragments of his past, he entered a sphere in which interest, doubt, and ambition converged. And within that sphere, protection and manipulation were often indistinguishable. At this delicate juncture in Kaspar Hauser's life, a new figure entered the scene, one whose role remains controversial to this day. Lord Stanhope, an English nobleman of education and means, appeared at first glance as a benefactor. He took a keen interest in Kaspar's circumstances, offered financial support, and positioned himself as an advocate in the search for truth. Outwardly, Stanhope seemed committed to clarifying Kaspar's origins. He arranged inquiries, corresponded with officials, and presented himself as a rational intermediary between curiosity and skepticism. Yet, beneath this veneer of patronage, ambiguities began to surface. Stanhope did not merely observe, he interpreted. He filtered Kaspar's statements through his own judgment. Assertions that hinted toward dynastic significance were treated cautiously, sometimes skeptically. Over time, his tone shifted. Where he had once expressed sympathy, he now emphasized doubt. The turning point came on the 17th of October, 1829. Caspar was discovered injured, bleeding from a head wound. He reported that he had been attacked by an unknown assailant. The circumstances were unclear. Had someone attempted to silence him? Was it a warning? Or had the incident occurred under different conditions than he described? Stanhope responded swiftly and decisively. He expressed skepticism regarding Kaspar's account. He suggested the possibility of self-inflicted harm. Psychological instability was invoked. The narrative began to shift. Authorities adopted a more cautious stance. Public opinion grew divided. A subtle but decisive transformation occurred. Caspar was no longer viewed primarily as a potential victim of intrigue. Increasingly, he was portrayed as unreliable, perhaps imaginative, possibly manipulative. Such reclassification had profound consequences. For once doubt attaches to a person's character, it overshadows every claim they make. The focus moves away from structural questions about succession, about motive, about power, and settles instead upon personality. To this day, interpretations of Lord Stanhope differ. Was he an earnest man who came to doubt what he once believed? Or did he act, consciously or unconsciously, in alignment with interests larger than himself? His later writings were unambiguous. He declared Kaspar Hauser an impostor, a figure shaped by fantasy and suggestion. Yet what is striking is not merely what he concluded, but what he did not pursue. There was no sustained effort to investigate the Baden succession theory with equal vigor, no determined challenge to official silence. After the first attack, the atmosphere changed irrevocably. Caspar was no longer simply a mystery, he had become a problem. And in political contexts, problems are rarely left unresolved for long. The final chapter of Kaspar Hauser's life unfolded in the Bavarian town of Ansbach. Removed from the intense public scrutiny that had once surrounded him, his existence had grown quieter, almost subdued. Yet, beneath this apparent calm, tensions persisted, questions unanswered, suspicions unresolved. On the 14th of December, 1833, Caspar left his residence and walked toward the court garden. Hours later, he returned gravely wounded. A deep stab wound marked his chest. His strength diminished rapidly, yet he was still able to speak. He claimed that a stranger had lured him into the garden under the pretense of revealing important information. There, he said, the man attacked him and left behind a small purse containing a cryptic note. 3 days later, Kaspar Hauser was dead. The official investigation proceeded swiftly. Too swiftly, some would later argue. Before long, a familiar interpretation emerged. Self-infliction. An accident, perhaps an act driven by psychological instability. Once again, suspicion shifted from the possibility of external conspiracy to the character of the victim. Yet inconsistencies remained. The wound was precise, delivered with force and deliberation. Medical observers questioned whether Caspar, weakened and slight of build, could have inflicted such an injury upon himself. The note found in the purse appeared carefully constructed, more theatrical than spontaneous. Public opinion fractured. Some concluded that the young man had lived and died within a web of illusion. Others believed his death to be the final act of a concealed truth too dangerous to surface. The authorities closed the case. The narrative of self-infliction prevailed. Stability, it seemed, had been restored. Kaspar Hauser died at the age of 21. Without legal recognition of noble birth, without definitive acknowledgement of his origins, without justice in any formal sense, and yet, his death did not silence the questions. It amplified them. Was he the victim of his own fragility? Or did he die because his very existence threatened a lineage that preferred certainty over scrutiny? It was only after Kaspar Hauser's death that a jurist of considerable stature undertook a more systematic examination of the case. Anselm von Feuerbach, president of the Bavarian Court of Appeal and a respected legal philosopher, approached the matter not as a sensation, but as a question of principle. Feuerbach was not inclined toward romantic speculation. He was concerned with inconsistencies, with procedural gaps, with the curious haste that seemed to characterize each official conclusion. To him, the central issue was not whether Caspar's personality was flawed or impressionable. It was whether the investigation had ever been conducted with genuine impartiality. He returned repeatedly to a simple but penetrating question. Quibono? Who benefits? Who benefited if Kaspar Hauser were declared a fraud? Who benefited if his claims were discredited before they could be fully examined? And who benefited if his death were explained in a manner that foreclosed further inquiry? Feuerbach observed a pattern. Each time the discussion approached the possibility of a dynastic connection, particularly the events of 1812, it was redirected. Doubts about Caspar's psychological stability replaced structural questions about succession and motive. Personal credibility overshadowed political context. In his writings, Feuerbach described Caspar not as an eccentric, but as a potential victim of systemic concealment. For him, the case illuminated a broader tension between justice and power. When political stability is perceived to be at stake, the search for truth may become secondary. Feuerbach's reflections did not overturn official narratives. They did not reopen courts or reverse verdicts, but they preserved an alternative interpretation, one grounded in legal reasoning rather than sentiment. Through his work, the possibility remained alive that Kaspar Hauser's story was not a fabrication, but an unfinished chapter of European dynastic history. For nearly 2 centuries, the case of Kaspar Hauser existed within the realm of conjecture. Arguments were constructed from letters, testimonies, and circumstantial evidence. Interpretations shifted with political climates and historiographical fashions. Yet, in 2024, a new dimension entered the discourse, one not shaped by rhetoric, but by molecular analysis. Advances in genetic technology made it possible to compare biological samples attributed to Kaspar Hauser with verified descendants of the House of Baden. Hair samples and preserved material, whose authenticity had long been debated, underwent renewed examination under modern forensic standards. The results were cautious, as responsible scholarship demands. They did not proclaim certainty. They did not assign guilt. Yet they indicated a statistically significant genetic proximity to the maternal line associated with Stephanie de Beauharnais. The probability that Kaspar Hauser had no connection whatsoever to the Baden lineage diminished substantially. Such findings do not constitute a legal verdict. DNA can establish biological relationships. It cannot reconstruct intention. It cannot reveal who orchestrated events in 1812, nor can it illuminate the silence that followed. Science, in this sense, provides illumination but not narrative. And yet, something decisive has shifted. For generations, the accusation that Kaspar Hauser was a mere impostor served as the simplest resolution. It allowed institutions to close files and historians to move on. The genetic evidence of 2024 complicates that simplicity. It does not compel a single conclusion, but it renders dismissal intellectually untenable. If a biological link to the Baden Dynasty is plausible, then the implications extend beyond personal identity. They touch upon legitimacy, succession, and the moral cost of preserving political order. 200 years after his death, Kaspar Hauser re-enters history not as legend, but as a subject of empirical reconsideration. In the end, there is no triumphant resolution. History rarely grants such clarity. It offers layers, interpretations, shaped by power, by memory, by silence, and sometimes, centuries later, by science. Kaspar Hauser remains suspended between documentation and doubt. Officially, he was a foundling of uncertain origin, a young man of fragile constitution and contested credibility. Yet the convergence of historical irregularities, legal inquiry, and modern genetic analysis suggests a different possibility, one that cannot easily be dismissed. If he was indeed the legitimate heir of Baden, then his life was not merely tragic. It was displaced, redirected, erased in order to stabilize a succession. If he was not, then the persistence of this belief reveals something equally revealing about the anxieties of dynastic Europe. What does it mean when identity can be altered by decree? When silence becomes policy? When truth must wait for technology to be heard? The DNA findings of 2024 do not close the case. They reopen it. They compel us to reconsider narratives long regarded as settled, and they remind us that history is not static. It evolves as new evidence emerges. Perhaps the most enduring question is not whether Kaspar Hauser was a prince. It is whether history belongs to those who rule or to those who were denied the chance to be remembered.